The steam rose from the industrial dishwasher like morning fog off a battlefield, and Vera Castellanos moved through it with the same silent precision she had once used to navigate enemy territory. Her weathered hands scrubbed plates with methodical efficiency, while her dark eyes tracked every conversation in the mess hall behind her. The soldiers saw only the quiet woman in kitchen whites, her graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her shoulders slightly stooped from years of leaning over prep tables. They had no idea those same hands had once assembled listening devices smaller than quarters, or that her ears, tuned to the clatter of silverware, could isolate a whispered conversation in 3 languages from across a crowded room. To Sergeant Briggs and his crew at Table 7, she was invisible, just another fixture of base life like the coffee machines or the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed people being underestimated in your own community. Vera dried her hands on her apron and began arranging tomorrow's meal prep with the same attention to detail she had once applied to intelligence reports that could topple governments. The morning rush brought its usual chaos, trays clattering and boots stomping across worn linoleum as hungry soldiers lined up for chow. Vera ladled scrambled eggs with mechanical precision, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality as Corporal Hendricks made his daily joke about the mystery meat. She had heard variations of it in 17 different languages across 4 continents, but she smiled politely and kept serving. Behind her practiced indifference, her mind cataloged details that would have impressed her former handlers at Langley. The new lieutenant at Table 3 spoke with a slight accent that placed him from northern Michigan, possibly Marquette area based on the vowel patterns. The supply sergeant had ink stains on his left fingers, suggesting he was left-hand and had been filling out requisition forms recently. Small observations that painted larger pictures for those trained to see them. Private Morrison slapped his tray down harder than necessary, sloshing coffee onto the metal surface. Just a kitchen lady, he muttered to his buddy, probably never been outside this base her whole life. Vera continued spooning hash browns, but her grip tightened imperceptibly on the serving ladle. If only he knew that this same kitchen lady had once walked through the streets of Beirut with a briefcase containing intelligence that prevented 3 embassy bombings. The inventory clipboard in Vera's hands looked innocent enough, but her pen moved with the efficiency of someone who had once documented weapons caches in hostile territories. She counted cases of MREs with the same methodical attention she had once applied to tracking enemy supply lines through satellite imagery. Each number she recorded told a story about base operations, troop movements, and consumption patterns that most people would never notice. Captain Torres approached the supply closet where she worked, his boots clicking against the concrete floor with military precision. "Need anything special for the officers' dinner tomorrow night?" he asked, his tone carrying the casual dismissal reserved for support staff. Vera looked up from her clipboard, noting the slight tension around his eyes and the way his hand unconsciously touched his service pistol. Something was making the captain nervous. She recommended the braised beef, suggesting it would pair well with the burgundy she had noticed in the officer's mess wine selection. Torres raised an eyebrow, surprised by her knowledge of wine pairings. Most cooks on base stuck to opening cans and heating frozen entrees, but Vera had learned about wine during a 3-month undercover assignment in a Parisian restaurant, gathering intelligence on arms dealers who frequented the establishment. The captain nodded approvingly and walked away, unaware that he had just received advice from someone who had once dined with foreign ministers. The afternoon brought an unusual stillness to the mess hall that Vera recognized from her years in the field. It was the kind of quiet that preceded storms, the breath-holding silence before operations went sideways. She wiped down tables with deliberate strokes, while her peripheral vision tracked the huddle of officers near the coffee station. Their voices were low, urgent, punctuated by the occasional sharp gesture that spoke of mounting frustration. Colonel Brennan entered through the side door, his normally composed demeanor cracked by barely controlled tension. He scanned a room with the systematic sweep of someone expecting threats, his gaze passing over Vera without recognition. She had perfected the art of invisibility years ago, becoming part of the furniture in rooms where secrets were traded like currency. The colonel's aide whispered something that made his jaw tighten, and Vera caught fragments of words that painted a troubling picture. Communication blackout. Assets compromised. Need alternative channels. The phrases drifted across the room like smoke, invisible to everyone except someone trained to gather intelligence from whispered conversations. Vera continued her methodical cleaning, but her mind was already assembling the pieces of a puzzle that the officers themselves might not fully understand. Whatever crisis was brewing, it required the kind of unconventional thinking that military protocols rarely accommodated. The kind of thinking that had once made Savage Quill a legend in intelligence circles. The evening shift brought fewer diners, but more tension, the kind that made experienced soldiers check their weapons twice and speak in shorter sentences. Vera noticed how the junior officers pushed food around their plates without eating, their appetites consumed by whatever crisis had transformed the base from routine operations into barely controlled chaos. She moved through the serving area like a ghost, refilling water pitchers and clearing tables while absorbing every scrap of information that floated through the air. Lieutenant Nakamura sat alone at the corner table, staring at a tablet screen with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. His fingers drummed against the metal surface in a pattern that Vera recognized as Morse code, a nervous habit from someone who had learned military communications the old-fashioned way. She approached with a coffee pot, her movements casual and unthreatening, the perfect cover for someone who needed to get close enough to read over his shoulder. The tablet displayed a map of the region with red markers indicating compromised positions and broken communication lines. 3 operatives were marked as missing, their last known positions forming a triangle around a location that made Vera's blood run cold. She had been there before, years ago, when the place was supposed to be abandoned. The lieutenant looked up as she poured his coffee, his eyes reflecting the same helpless frustration she had seen in dozens of briefing rooms where conventional solutions had failed. The pre-dawn hours found Vera in the kitchen earlier than usual, her hands working through bread dough with the same steady rhythm she had once used to maintain cover while surveillance targets slept in nearby rooms. The base felt different in these quiet moments before reveille, when shadows held secrets and the only sounds were her own controlled breathing and the distant hum of generators. She shaped roles with practiced efficiency while her mind worked through the fragments of intelligence she had gathered. The missing operatives were not random casualties of a botched mission. Their positions formed a deliberate pattern around coordinates that matched a location from her own classified past, a place where she had once spent 3 months posing as a humanitarian aid worker while mapping underground networks that smuggled everything from weapons to information. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental, which meant someone with access to old operational files was either setting a trap or sending a very specific message. Major Sinclair entered the kitchen through the back door, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes carrying the red-rimmed exhaustion of someone who had been staring at computer screens all night. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man trying not to show desperation, but Vera could read the signs as clearly as if they were printed in mission briefing format. The Major poured himself coffee from the pot she kept brewing for early risers, his hands trembling slightly from caffeine and stress. The breakfast service became a theater of barely controlled panic as word spread through unofficial channels that the situation had deteriorated overnight. Vera served pancakes and bacon to soldiers who spoke in hushed tones about extraction teams and failed rescue attempts, their conversations painting a picture of an operation spiraling beyond conventional military solutions. She moved between tables like a confessor, invisible but omnipresent, collecting intelligence that would have taken trained analysts hours to compile. Colonel Brennan stood at the far end of the hall, his phone pressed to his ear as he paced in tight circles that spoke of a man running out of options. Vera caught fragments of his conversation as she cleared nearby tables, Words like unconventional assets and off-the-book solutions that made her pulse quicken with recognition. She had been an unconventional asset once, the kind of operative who appeared in files marked with classifications that most officers never saw. The colonel ended his call with visible frustration, his face carrying the weight of impossible decisions. He surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of someone considering desperate measures, his eyes passing over the assembled personnel as if searching for a miracle hidden among the familiar faces. Vera finished stacking plates with mechanical precision, knowing that miracles in intelligence work usually came disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things when nobody expected them to be capable of anything more than their cover identity suggested. The lunch crowd thinned to almost nothing as officers were called away to emergency briefings that lasted longer than planned and returned looking more haggard than before. Vera cleaned the serving line with methodical precision while tracking the movement of personnel through the hall, noting who appeared, who was absent, and who looked like they had been asked to do things that kept them awake at night. The rhythm of base life had shifted into crisis mode, and she recognized the signs from dozens of operations that had reached the breaking point. Captain Torres returned from his third briefing of the day, his shoulders carrying the weight of someone who had been given impossible orders. He sat alone at his usual table, staring at his untouched sandwich while his fingers drummed against the metal surface in patterns that betrayed military communications training. Vera approached with a fresh cup of coffee, noting the way his eyes tracked her movement with the hypervigilance of someone operating under extreme stress. The captain looked up as she set down the cup, his gaze lingering on her face with a flicker of something that might have been recognition or curiosity. "Have we met before?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone probing for information without revealing why they needed it. Vera smiled with the practiced neutrality she had perfected during years of maintaining cover identities. But something in his question suggested that her carefully constructed invisibility might be starting to crack. The afternoon brought an eerie silence that settled over the mess hall like dust after an explosion, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters that had been arriving and departing with increasing frequency. Vera finished her prep work for the evening meal, while monitoring the encrypted radio chatter that leaked from portable units carried by officers who had forgotten that kitchen staff possessed functioning ears. The fragments she caught painted a picture of total communication breakdown and rescue operations that had turned into body recovery missions. General Morrison entered through the main doors with the bearing of a man who had run out of conventional options and was now considering alternatives that would never appear in official reports. His aide followed close behind, carrying a tablet that displayed satellite imagery and personnel files that made Vera's pulse quicken with recognition. She had seen similar briefings in secure facilities where desperate situations required extraordinary measures and plausible deniability. The general's eyes swept the nearly empty hall with the systematic attention of someone conducting reconnaissance, his gaze pausing on each face as if searching for something specific among the familiar personnel. Vera continued wiping down surfaces with practiced invisibility, but she could feel the weight of scrutiny that suggested her years of careful anonymity were about to end. When his eyes finally found hers across the room, she saw the moment of recognition that preceded the kind of phone calls that changed everything. The general approached with measured steps that echoed through the nearly empty hall, his aide trailing behind with the tablet that contained files Vera had hoped would remain buried forever. She continued her cleaning routine while calculating exit routes and defensive positions from muscle memory that 15 years of civilian life had not erased. The familiar weight of operational awareness settled over her like an old coat, transforming the harmless kitchen worker into something far more dangerous. General Morrison stopped 3 feet from her position, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to respect the personal space of someone whose real capabilities he was beginning to remember. "Ms. Castellanos," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone addressing a civilian who might not be entirely civilian. We have a situation that requires unconventional expertise, and my intelligence officer believes you might have insights that could prove valuable to our current operation. Vera set down her cleaning cloth with deliberate precision, her movements controlled and economical in a way that had nothing to do with kitchen work and everything to do with years of training that never truly faded. She met his gaze directly for the first time since arriving at the base, allowing him to see past the carefully constructed facade of the invisible support staff member. "I think you have me confused with someone else, General," she replied quietly, but her tone carried undertones that suggested the confusion might be entirely intentional. The general's aide stepped forward with the tablet, its screen displaying a personnel file that made Vera's carefully maintained anonymity crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The photograph showed a younger version of herself in dress blues, her chest decorated with commendations that few people earned and fewer still survived to wear. Below the image, a service record detailed operations across 3 continents and classifications that required presidential authorization to access. "Savage Quill," the general said quietly, using the codename that had once struck fear into enemy intelligence networks and earned grudging respect from allies who preferred not to know exactly how she accomplished the impossible. The woman who walked into Tehran with nothing but a stolen passport and walked out with the location of every sleeper cell in Western Europe. The operative who convinced a Russian arms dealer to defect by serving him dinner and discussing wine pairings while his own security team sat at the next table. Vera looked around the empty mess hall, noting the security cameras that had been quietly disabled and the doors that now showed signs of being sealed from the outside. The general had planned this confrontation with the same attention to detail she would have used, creating a secure environment where legends could step out of retirement and old ghosts could discuss new nightmares. She straightened to her full height, shedding the invisible kitchen worker persona like a snake discarding old skin, and let him see the predator that had been hiding among the prey. 24 hours later, the mess hall buzzed with whispered conversations about the impossible rescue mission that had extracted 3 operatives from a location everyone had written off as a death trap. Vera moved through the serving line with the same quiet efficiency as before, but now the soldiers watched her with the reverent attention reserved for living legends. She had returned from the dead zone with intelligence that would reshape regional operations and confirmation that some people never truly retire from the game. Colonel Brennan approached her station during the evening meal, his bearing transformed from desperate frustration to profound respect. He waited until she finished serving the last customer before speaking, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone addressing a superior officer regardless of current rank structure. "The Joint Chiefs want to discuss reactivation," he said quietly, "but we understand if civilian life has become too comfortable to abandon." Vera smiled as she began cleaning the serving equipment, her movements carrying the same methodical precision that had once dismantled enemy networks across 4 continents. "Comfort is overrated, Colonel," she replied, her tone suggesting that 15 years of anonymity might have been exactly the kind of deep cover that legends used to prepare for their next impossible mission. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar hidden strength in the people around you. Sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities hide behind the most ordinary faces.